Chapter 22. Miss Brotherton sets off on her travels and feels frightened at her own temerity, but speedily recovers her courage and plats the heroine. She visits some factories and is introduced to a Sunday school. She approaches the precincts of the Deep Valley. It was about 9 o'clock on a bright autumn morning that Miss Brotherton and her faithful nurse mounted into a lumbering six-inside vehicle bound for their two small trunks, with Miss Tremlett passenger modestly written on both, were safely lodged on the top. Miss Bell gave them a silent blessing and a silent nod. The horseboy vociferated, "All right!" and the richest young lady in Lancashire rolled off, very literally, in search of adventures. The novelty of her situation, of her sensations of every kind, the unceremonious examination bestowed upon her by a smart young clerk who sat opposite, the anxious look of Miss Tremlett's usually tranquil face, and the consciousness that the enterprise she was upon must even by herself be characterized as wildly extravagant, if not carried through with much steady courage and discretion, altogether produced a feeling of oppression on her heart that very nearly overcame her. Am I acting rightly in thus exposing myself? Was the question that her startled nerves suggested, and had her conscience been unable to answer it boldly and promptly, her condition would have been really pitiable. Happily, however, this was not the case. There was some feminine timidity about Mary Brotherton, but not an atom of false shame or of affectation of any kind. "Yes, I am right," was the answer recorded on her heart of hearts, "and shame to me if I shrink at the first step, for no better reason than because the dust flies and a vulgar young man stares me in the face." From that moment Mary recoiled no more, and a little resolute meditation on her object and of the strength demanded to obtain it so effectively restored her usual self-possession that she looked round upon her fellow travellers with as little embarrassment as if she had been used to travel in public all her life, nodded to Mrs. Tremlett with an encouraging smile, and thought how very silly people were who fancied that everything unusual must of necessity be terrible. "Are you going all the way to, miss?" said Are you going all the way to, miss?" said a good-natured looking woman who sat bodkin between the smart clerk and Miss Tremlett. "Yes, ma'am, I am," replied Mary civilly. The good-natured woman twisted herself round to reconnoitre Miss Tremlett. Your mamma, I suppose, my dear." "No, ma'am. The lady is a friend." "Oh, I ask your pardon. You are so very much alike's made me say it." Mary bowed. Miss Tremlett smiled. The good-natured looking woman preserved in the same train of pertinent observation, sometimes addressed to one passenger and sometimes to another, so as to prevent the party from sinking into total silence, which might otherwise perhaps have happened. But Mary bore her share in this trifling annoyance with perfect good humour, and when at length they arrived at, and Miss Tremlett asked her in a rather piteous accents, the moment they were alone together, whether she did not feel dreadfully worn out, she cheerfully replied, "Not the least in the world, my dear friend." "Thank God," replied the old woman fervently. "I know you do so hate to be bothered, Mary, and that I was afraid that old fool would put you out of all patience." "Times are altered with me now, Nurse Tremlett," replied Mary. "I have left off living for myself, and I feel my temper improving already by it. Now then, ring the bell and give your orders. Remember, nurse, you are the great lady, and I must order everything." Encouraged by this cheerful submission to circumstances, which was in truth somewhat more than she expected, Miss Tremlett began to think that Mary might indeed prove capable of carrying through the scheme, the first sketch of which had appeared so wild that nothing short of devotion to her will, which knew no bounds, could have surmounted her averseness to it. "My darling child," cried the old woman, looking at her with equal admiration and delight, "your mind is as strong as your heart is tender, and never will I again oppose my silly ignorance to anything you wish to do." It was not difficult in this first stage of their expedition to follow exactly the plan that had been laid down. The two ladies professed themselves to be travellers, anxious to see all objects of curiosity, and particularly the factories, which were, as they observed, so famous throughout all the world. The master of the hotel where they lodged exerted himself with the utmost civility to gratify so natural a desire, and Miss Tremlett and Mary were accordingly promenaded on the following morning through one of the largest establishments of the town. It is probable, from the drowsiness of the public mind on the subject, that many strangers who are in like manner led by skilful officials through the various floors of a factory retire from the spectacle they present without having any feeling of sympathy excited by the cursory glance they have thrown over the silent, unobtrusive little beings, one moment of whose unchanging existence they have been permitted to witness. It is the vast, the beautiful, the elaborate machinery by which they were surrounded that called forth all their attention and all their wonder. The uniform, ceaseless movement, sublime in its sturdy strength and unrelenting activity, drew every eye and wrapped the observer's mind in boundless admiration of the marvelous power of science. No wonder that along every line a score of noiseless children toiled, unthought of, after the admirable machine. Strangers do not visit factories to look at them. It is the triumphant perfection of British mechanism which they come to see. It is of that they speak, of that they think, of that they boast when they leave the life-consuming process behind them. The more delicate and, alas, living springs by which the great artificer has given movement to the beings made in his own image are not worth a thought, the while the scientific spectator sees nothing to excite his intellectual acumen in them. He hardly knows that they are there, but gazes with enthusiasm and almost reverence on the myriads of whirling spindles amidst which they breathe their groans, unheeded and unheard. But it was not thus that Mary won her way through the whirling, hissing world of machinery into which she now entered for the first time in her life. The hot, tainted atmosphere seemed to weigh upon her spirits, as well as upon her lungs, and the weary aspect of the drakes, the falling joints of the Edward Armstrong became fearfully intelligible as she watched the children, and she watched nothing else, who dragged their attenuated limbs along. Then it was that Mr. Bell's tremendous statement of the number of suffering beings thus employed came with full force upon her mind. She would have given years of existence at that moment could she have believed it false. 200,000 little creatures, created by the abounding mercy of God, with faculties for enjoyment so perfect that no poverty short of actual starvation can check their joy, so long as innocence and liberty be left to them. 200,000 little creatures, for whose freedom from toil during their tender years the awful voice of nature has gone forth to be snatched away, living and feeling, from the pure air of heaven, while the beautiful process is going on by which their delicate fabric gradually strengthens into maturity, taken forever from all with which their Maker has surrounded them for the purpose of completing his own noblest work, taken and lodged amidst stench and stunning, terrifying tumult, driven to and fro till their little limbs bend under them, hour after hour, day after day, the repose of a moment to be purchased only by yielding their tender bodies to the fist, the heel, or the strap of the overlooker. All this rushed together upon poor Mary's heart and soul, and turning deadly pale, she seized the arm of her friend to save herself from falling. "Terrible hot day!" roared their conductor, in a hideous scream by which some human voices can battle successfully with the din of machinery. Fortunately, they were near the door of the room, and Miss Tremlett, urging her steps forward, now brought her to an open window outside it. The fresh air, so carefully excluded within, soon revived her. The color returned to her lips, and having remained silently inhaling the breeze for another minute or two, she signified her wish to proceed. "Not now, Mary, pray, not now," said the frightened Miss Tremlett. Indeed, you have not the strength for it." Mary gave her one steady look, and the opposition ceased, for it said as plainly as look could speak, "Is it thus that I shall find Mchl Armstrong?" "For a moment I felt the heat oppressive," said Miss Brotherton, in a voice of steady composure. "But I am quite sure the sensation will not return. I came to on a purpose to see the factories, my dear friend, and indeed you must not disappoint me." "The young lady's right," replied their conductor. "She'll never see the like of our mills, you may depend upon that. Why, all the machinery in the known world put all together won't equal one of our spinning mills. There is nothing in creation to compare to it, and I don't question but the young lady heard as much as before she come. so it would be altogether wrong to disappoint her of the sight of 'em." "Thank you," said Mary. "Are we to go upstairs now?" "Yes, if you please, miss. We have got 7 stories here, and thank God, all is busy just now, one as the other, from the bottom to the top." On entering the room, Mary felt, as she expected, that her bodily strength was quite sufficient to sustain her. She had not habituated herself to seek the sun upon the upland lawn for nothing. Few girls so lapped in luxury could boast of equal vigor and activity. The first aspect of the system, the horrors of which had been so clearly explained to her, in action, was for a moment overwhelming. But it was past. The terrible premier pas could not come again, and far from shrinking from the task she had imposed upon herself, she left the enormous fabric, after having perseveringly mounted to its summit, with the satisfactory conviction that she should not fail in her enterprise either from want of strength or want of will. Good Miss Tremlett, however, still felt less confident upon the subject, and no sooner found herself tete-a-tete with her young mistress within the shelter of their drawing-room than she said, "You will never stand it, Miss Mary, feeling about it all as you do. The sight of those poor, ragged, sickly little souls will be the death of you." "Then so let me die, dear nurse," replied Mary. "If I have not vigor enough both of mind and body to be in some degree useful, I should hardly think it worth while to live. But I know myself better, Nurse Tremlett. I turned sick and giddy, I confess, on entering that first room. But it is my friend, Mr. Bell, who has to answer for it. The impressions received at that moment by my senses served as a specimen of all the horrors he had described to me. The account I had heard enabled me at a glance to comprehend the scene before me, while the scene itself acted back again, as it were, upon my memory, making me understand 1,000 times more clearly than before all the frightful details he had given me. The effect of this was overpowering, but it cannot return upon me again in the same manner. I am already hardened. Think, therefore, no more of me, dear friend, but let us cogitate together upon the likeliest way of turning all such visits to account." This cogitation led them both to the conclusion that it might, for the sake of appearances, be as well to take the landlord's recommendation to another of the establishments, usually pointed out to the attention of strangers, and then to consult the ivory tablets, and venture upon a visit to the only one near named therein, as notorious for the reception of apprentices. In pursuance of this plan, the waiter was again interrogated when he attended the ladies at their luncheon, and again he brought a written address from his master, accompanied by a message intimating that the following morning, being Sunday, the ladies might have the advantage of visiting the Sunday school attached to the factory, for which he had given the address, to a sight of which they would be admitted without difficulty, if they would make known their wishes for such admission to the person who would show them the factory. "There is a Sunday school attached to the establishment?" Mary said, in an accent of great satisfaction. "Yes, miss," replied the man. "Messrs. Robert and Joseph Tumlins, the serious gentleman as owns the factory, has built a schoolroom altogether at their own expense, and attends their own selves in person every Sunday morning to see that both master and children puts the time to profit. Their factory is about a mile or so out of town, but master says he can let you have the carriage very reasonable." "I should wish to go there by all means," replied Mary. "Desire the carriage may be got ready for us directly." The man left the room to obey her. "Thank heavens!" exclaimed Mary as the door closed behind him. "There is, then, some Christian feeling still left among them here, as well as at Bradford. We shall not, here at least, be shocked by witnessing such degrading ignorance as that of the poor Drakes. They are treated like Christian children, at any rate." "More surely it is a pleasure to hear of it, my dear," replied Miss Tremlett. "And it is quite as well, Mary, that we have got to ride to it, at least if you feel like me, my dear."